So do you think that the lockdowns were necessary?
Well, we don't have access to the same advice that the state government has, and we've, up till now, and continue to back the decisions that the Andrews government has made, because they've been health-led decisions, and we think that's the right way to respond to this crisis. But the reason that so many of the residents that I've been speaking to over the last 24, 36 hours are angry is that many of them understand the need for restrictions, but they are incredibly angry with how it's been executed. Because what happened was that Daniel Andrews and Richard Wynne, the housing minister, they sent in the police first, but they didn't send in medicines or food or care workers or social workers with them. So it was a force-led response rather than a care-led response. And so for the last 24 hours, people have been saying, well, where am I going to get my food? Where am I going to get my medicines? What happens to me? And there's been no answers. And so, to give you an example, one woman was on her way out to get baby formula. The police said, no, I'm sorry, you can't leave. She said, I've got to go and get baby formula. Can you go and buy it for me? And the police officer said, no, I can't. And she said, well, who can go and get it for me? I don't know. Is there a number I can call to get someone to deliver it to me? I don't know that either. Sorry, you're just going to have to sit and wait. And what's happened is that the community has rallied around, and now the community is trying to get in and provide a lot of these kind of supports to people. But it's as if the government didn't think about any of that. It's as if the government just said, well, we'll lock everyone down by putting the police there, and then all of those other questions about how to deal with people's physical health and their mental health have all been afterthoughts, and that is making people very, very angry, and rightly so.
So do you think that aggressive response from the government is, in a way, a panicked response given the shortcomings from the hotel quarantine from recent weeks that we've seen?
Well, some might say that, and certainly the residents there are asking why is such a large police presence necessary? Is the assumption there that suddenly that people don't know the rules to follow, or that they're suddenly going to try and break the rules? People there feel like they've been treated like second-class citizens. And again, when I was at North Melbourne Towers yesterday, someone sent a message out to us that said, look, we understand the need for the lockdown. I just don't understand why there's police everywhere here on my estate now, and why there's not other forms of support being given. And that's how they're feeling at the moment. And you've got to understand that this is, by definition, you need to either be on very low income or have some other form of vulnerability and disadvantage to be eligible for a place in public housing. A lot of this is people are overcrowded in there because the government hasn't built enough new public housing units. And now people are stuck in these places. Often, many people have got additional needs and have got complex needs. And look, it took us pushing the state government to get a hotline phone number for these people, and then there was no plans to even let the people know about what that hotline number was, and we had to go and make that happen ourselves. So there's a real sense that that the government's now playing catch up, that all of these things are afterthoughts, and that is just not good enough.
The authorities had mentioned on Friday that up to 10,000 people have so far refused to be tested for COVID-19. Do you think people should be fined if they refuse a test?
I think everyone should get a test, and if someone comes and asks you for a test. And so one of my messages to everyone who's living in public housing is, I know that this is distressing at the moment, and we will fight as hard as we can to make sure you get the essentials and to alleviate the distress. But if someone comes and asks for a test, please get one. As to what the appropriate sanctions are for someone who doesn't get a test, I know the state government is looking at that, and of course there's big problems with forcing people to have tests, but I would say if someone comes to your door to get a test, please get one. But in terms of those numbers about people refusing to get tested, some of the analysis that I've read suggests that part of that might be that some people have said, look, I don't want a nasal swab, I want to get a saliva test, and that gets marked as a refusal. So some of these things, or it might be, I don't understand what you're saying, can you come back later? So I think we need to look at those numbers and sort of drill down into them a bit before we draw any conclusions.
Yeah, right. We had some video on a show, on a most recent news bulletin, that some of the products are actually past their use-by date. I mean, what are you hearing when it comes to that from the residents that you're talking to?
Well, again, a lot of this is being, if we're talking about products like food, there's a large Muslim population in a number of these tower blocks, and I've seen photos of meal packs that have been delivered that contain pork products in them. Like there's a lot of, there's suggestions that the government's not really thought this through, and the packages that have been delivered haven't to date contained a lot of fresh fruit, and we're hearing a lot of talk from the providers and behind the scenes about how difficult that's been to get into the building. So I think, again, it shows a real lack of thinking about this, and I don't understand why they didn't have this sorted out before they pulled the trigger on the lockdown in the first place.
Just some closing thoughts on the by-election on the weekend, Adam. It's your first as Greens leader, but the Greens saw their primary vote fall from 8.8% to 5.6%. That's in less than a year. It's not exactly a glowing endorsement, is it?
I think the by-election did send a clear message to the government about acting on the climate crisis, and the government said that, talked up the once-in-a-100-year scenario that they were in and suggested they were in with a chance of snatching it, and they didn't. And look, by-elections are always difficult for us, especially when we don't then have a national campaign to leverage off, and especially in this instance where there was a Melbourne Cup field of candidates. We're quite happy with the result that we've got, with our vote held up in the context of a difficult by-election for us. But we think ultimately, at the end of the day, when you think about how many on the government side were out there talking up the prospect of winning back a seat, that didn't eventuate, and in fact can't eventuate in a once-in-a-100-year environment. You wonder, I think, is sending a very clear message to the government.
Well, that dropped, though.
And can I say too, lastly, Labor held on, but Labor held on in part because of Greens' preferences, and that should send also a very clear message to Labor now that have won this seat off the back of people who want to see action on climate change, and as Labor starts to formulate its policies going to the next election, it has to have action on climate front and centre.
But that drop, though, from 8.8 to 5.6%, though, do you see that as a reflection of your leadership?
No, and like I said, we knew that this was going to be a challenging by-election for us as a smaller party when you don't have a national campaign to leverage off and you don't have the resources of the others. We always knew it was going to be challenging, and our candidate Kathy Griff did a great job. And so, no, we went into this knowing we're up with a Melbourne Cup field, and we feel like we put in a solid showing.
Do you feel like, though, that you still need to do a bit more to convince voters about your Green New Deal policy platform?
No, I feel like people are understanding that we're about tackling the climate crisis at the same time as tackling the jobs crisis. And as I say, we feel very much that our vote held up, and that was in part because of a reflection that people got that you can tackle both, that you can tackle the climate crisis at the same time as tackling the jobs and inequality crisis, which is what the Green New Deal is about, and I think it's serving us well.
Having said that, and just finally here, in Cobargo, Labor went backwards by some 9%. The Liberals actually increased their primary vote in Batlow by 9%. I mean, these are areas that were badly damaged by bushfires, and some of the areas where the Prime Minister was treated in a less than kind way earlier in the year that you might remember. So doesn't this suggest that perhaps people are sort of starting to fold in behind the Liberals now when it comes to bushfire recovery?
Well, part of the reason that there were challenges for us, and that there were challenges, I think, in fact, for most of the candidates on the non-government side, is because clearly the corona crisis has dominated, and everyone has rightly dropped everything to deal with the corona crisis. And I think what we've seen happen in Australia is that it's been, state governments and a lot of public health officials have dragged the federal government over to a health first approach. And I think a lot of people look at Australia and think, geez, it's good that we're not the US at the moment, or it's that we're not seeing the kind of outbreaks that we're seeing in other countries. And that has, I think everyone across the political spectrum admits that benefits the people who are incumbents. It's benefiting the state premiers, and it's benefiting the federal prime ministers as well. So I think in that context, in the context of a by-election being conducted in the middle of the pandemic, I think it's a very wise but a very brave person who thinks that you can read the tea leaves there and find a lot of bigger and deeper trends going on.